Welcome to our webinar looking at COVID-19, analysing multiple outcome scenarios for the coronavirus pandemic. My name is Michael McCabe and I'm the CEO and founder of Intelligence Fusion. So Intelligence Fusion, we very much operate at the tactical level of intelligence. We monitor developments on the ground, which help us to produce accurate strategic and operational level forecasts based on high quality, extensive, accurate global data sets. Our analysts operate across large geographical intelligence boundaries, which means they don't become pigeonholed and can spot trends across multiple countries and regions, which will feed into today's presentation. I've watched some of the other webinars since the outbreak of COVID-19. And I felt they were very intelligence light. So at the end of this webinar, you'll have a good understanding for the patterns and trends that we are witnessing, what we can expect to witness in the areas with the COVID-19 outbreak, as well as an understanding of the direction of travel and the most likely courses of action, as well as the most dangerous courses of action, which we as a company will set indicators and warnings for, and then monitor through horizon scanning to see which scenario is actually coming true. So at the core of everything that we do is intelligence doctrine, and that is especially important for when we make assessments. We use the language of probability, which gives a numerical guide as to our assessment of confidence. And we also define our terms for time periods. So if I say this will occur in the short term, what I mean by that is in the next 0 to 6 months. And if I say this is almost certain of occurring, that means there is a 90% and over likelihood in our opinion. So looking at COVID-19 globally, there are currently 442,681 total global cases. With 19,819 total deaths, the virus has impacted 199 territories around the world and 114,057 people have totally recovered. The 10 countries worst impacted are shown, with the epicenter being initially China before shifting to Europe and the US. And I expect this to change over time as the epicenter shifts, with more developing nations reaching the top 10 due to their medical systems and other factors likely leading to a higher mortality rate. Now, what I want to show with this chart is just the comparison between the number of days and the actual 50,000 increase in infections. So for the world to go from 0 to 50,000 took 25 days. From 50,000 to 100,000 infections was 23 days. And then there was a significant reduction in the quantity of time it took to get from 100,000 to 150,000 at just 8 days. What we've then seen is almost a halving of the time that it's taken. So from 150,000 to 200,000, it was 4 days. And then from 200 to 250, 250 to 300, and 300 to 350, it was 2 days again. And then finally, from 350 to 400,000, it was a day. And really, with the actual quantities of infections being released normally on a daily basis by governments, we're probably now at around about 3/4 of a day to get to an additional 50,000 infections. The point that I'm making here is that the actual rate of infection is significantly increasing. So from a medical perspective, what impact will COVID-19 have on the medical system? So the first point I want to bring up is medical shortages. It's almost certain that there are going to be significant medical shortages as the quantity of patients overwhelm a nation's health system, especially in the case of respirators. Doctors may have to triage patients, not just those with COVID-19, based on who has the greatest chance of survival. And in New York, Mayor de Blasio warned that the largest US city will soon run out of many medical supplies and needs 3 million N95 masks, 50 million surgical masks, and 15,000 ventilators. Now, in northern Italy, they no longer give respirators to anybody over age of 60. And the worry is that due to the global nature of the pandemic, the closure of manufacturing sites around the world, stockpiles will run out and the lack of equipment will increase the mortality rate. This in turn leads to could lead to violent episodes at hospitals involving family members of patients. And in countries where the government's response is woeful, it is possible that we could witness mass demonstrations and riots. The military may also be required not just for medical and logistical support, but also to provide security to hospitals. Now, once COVID-19 is passed, in the UK, it's my assessment the NHS will get a large increase in funding. And in the US, this is likely going to open further wounds regarding the difference in healthcare for those with and without means. Now, just to show you some incidents which could exacerbate the problem, and what I should point out is that all the incidents I'm using as examples have been taken from the last 7 days. However, our data regarding COVID-19 goes back to January, and I literally spent all of yesterday trawling through our COVID-19 theme, which you can see on the screen, where we've got 2,600 incidents, just finding examples which kind of support the analysis that I'm going to mention today. So incidents like this will likely exacerbate the problem of medical shortages of equipment. So at a hospital in Manchester, 3 male suspects attempted to steal canisters of nitrous oxide. And this was replicated close to home for Intelligence Fusion in the northeast of England, with dozens of nitrous gas canisters being stolen. Now, our assessment is that this is likely due to inflation of drug prices because of logistical issues, and drug addicts are actually taking to stealing nitrous oxide canisters as a way to get high. In Putin, in the Netherlands, medical face masks and antibacterial gel were stolen from a clinic. In Sweden, medical supplies were stolen from a hospital in Stockholm. And in Italy, we've witnessed pharmacies being robbed with weapons and even medical supply logistical trucks. Now, there appears to be a difference in scale between robberies, likely split between opportunistic drug addict criminals and organised crime groups stealing medical supplies at scale to be sold on the black market. We've also witnessed vandalism and thefts against emergency services, such as this ambulance broken into in London and items that were stolen. In Kiev, face masks were stolen at gunpoint, and 3 male suspects were arrested after stealing 100,000 face masks with a value of $36,000 in a highly likely organised crime incident. We're also seeing governments requisitioning medical equipment during this crisis, like this incident in France where 2,000 masks were requisitioned from a convenience store. In Spain, the government have taken control of private hospitals to assist with the shortages of beds and equipment. In this incident in Spain, it highlights the grave consequences of a lack of equipment, where doctors are being forced to choose who to save, which has also been witnessed in Italy and likely in most locations where COVID-19 will impact. And it's worth pointing out that in some countries, those who speak out about the lack of equipment face severe punishment, like this nurse in Venezuela, who was arrested after filming a video denouncing the lack of medical equipment. Finally, in showing how quickly this situation is changing, as I didn't have time to include the actual incidents, just the tweet from our Europe Twitter handle that they put out. A paramedic was threatened in Cambridge, and we will get onto the threats against medical staff shortly in the presentation. Food was stolen from a primary school, and we'll also get onto food shortages. And oxygen, perhaps nitrous oxide, was stolen from a community hospital. So medical staff shortages is also a key issue, and it's almost certain that there are going to be significant medical staff shortages. This has already been witnessed in countries where the virus has taken significant hold. In Italy, for example, more than 4,800 of the country's healthcare workers have been infected with COVID-19, and that equates to almost 10% of all those infected. Now, this will have obvious impacts on not just the current COVID-19 crisis, but also the general health issues and emergencies a country witnesses, not just during a crisis. As the medical staff become tired and ill, mortality rates will likely increase, and this is why in the UK the government are trying to create an army of volunteers to help support the health service, as well as bring doctors and nurses out of retirement to support. In countries like Kenya, we've seen health workers threaten to go on strike if they do not receive adequate protection from the virus, and if this becomes a common theme, this will also increase the mortality rate. Another measure being taken in the UK and elsewhere is to postpone all non-essential medical treatment, and this will relieve pressure on the health service in the short term. However, some of these non-essential procedures may well become essential over time and will have an impact on the morale of the community. The targeting of medical staff is also a key feature, and it's almost certain that medical staff will face violence and abuse during this period. Now, health workers have been advised to remove NHS identification after leaving work following reports of a spate of muggings. Whittington hospital managers said that they reminded staff of the protocol after concerns circulated that the staff had been robbed on their way home. And it's been suggested that criminals are targeting the hospital workers for IDs to shop in supermarkets during morning windows reserved specifically for NHS staff. Now, the Met Police said on Monday of this week that they had no official reports of muggings, but despite this, they've contacted hospitals, including the Whittington, asking for more information. There were similar reports of muggings outside University College London Hospital and the Royal Free, and a doctor at Great Ormond Street Hospital told the New Journal that 2 junior doctors had been mugged for their phones after work. In another case, which is becoming frequently seen, a landlord evicted a paramedic over fears of him infecting them with COVID-19 in the UK. And in Belgium, a nurse was targeted by neighbours with notes saying that we're going to die because of you, and they also spat at her door. A doctor was also forced to leave home. Again, this could be another pattern and trend that we're going to witness globally. Part of my worry as an analyst is that what impact is this going to have on the community post-COVID-19? Will the scars of these incidents remain, and what impact will they have? One for us to monitor and analyse over the coming months. In an extreme incident in Bandar Abbas in Iran, a hospital was set on fire over fears COVID-19 patients had been transferred to the site. In Israel, in Haifa, a suspect drove his car into a drive-through test centre, causing significant damage. In Turkey, a doctor was assaulted after he told a man to return home as the hospital was not safe due to COVID-19. And in Iraq, supporters of Muqtada al-Sadr beat up a doctor who diagnosed a senior leader of Soraya al-Salam as having COVID-19. In the US, in Lady Lake, a woman claiming to have COVID-19 coughed in the face of a paramedic. And in Panama, harassment and discrimination was reported against medical professionals, with them being refused access to buses and told that they can't wear their uniforms in supermarkets. In Austria, an emergency response vehicle had its tyres punctured. In Margate in Kent, in the UK, 6 ambulances had their tyres drilled, preventing them from being used. Now, as an analyst, I find it very difficult to actually try and understand why this is occurring, but in some of these types of incidents, I'm just reminded of this quote from Batman, that some people just want to watch the world burn, and they're disturbed in their thinking and their actions to do something like this during a time of medical crisis. The final incident I want to mention is this one in New York, where a bomb threat was made against a COVID-19 testing post in New Rochelle to show how extreme things could go. Pedro Cheng allegedly called the office and said he was going to blow up the building with all you guys inside. The cost of medical treatment is also an issue as part of this crisis. So the quality of care will vary significantly based on your location, but also your means to pay for treatment. And this will likely cause protests to varying degree, with the worst case scenario we see as medical related riots at hospitals and government buildings. With the police likely becoming overstretched, enforcing curfews and quarantine measures, we will likely see the military protecting hospitals. In the US, an uninsured woman who was treated for COVID-19 ended up with a bill of almost $35,000. She is in the same boat as 27 million other Americans who have no medical insurance. And whilst they can apply for Medicaid, it seems likely that many Americans are going to be forced to pay for treatment, which is going to cause resentment. Drug treatment, it's almost certain that people will try and treat themselves. So the chief press secretary to the Lagos state governor raised the alarm over the rate of hospitals having to treat patients who've received chloroquine poisoning, and he warned people against harming themselves through the indiscriminate use of drugs. The warning came a day after American President Donald Trump announced that the US had approved the anti-malarial drug for use as a treatment against coronavirus. Now, Dr. William Grace, a Lenox Hill oncologist from the US, has stated that doctors are currently using hydroxychloroquine with or without a drug called Zithromax or zithromycin. This is reportedly preventing deaths. Now, the doctor stated that out of 100 patients that his hospital had treated, none have actually died. However, supplies of these drugs are now actually running low. So there's a situation where global leaders and experts are talking about the potential treatments, and people are taking it upon themselves to either buy and take the medication or buy in the case that they get COVID-19, which is then leading to shortages for medical staff. In a more extreme incident, we've had a few of these. A 53-year-old man died after drinking cologne in Turkey to protect himself from COVID-19. And in the Philippines, 2 men were arrested for claiming to have the cure for COVID-19. So moving on to illegal and counterfeit medicine and equipment. Europol has warned against a rise in counterfeit medications as criminals take advantage of the high demand. In our reporting, an illegal workshop used to create disinfectant was raided by police in Kazakhstan. 1 million face masks were seized in Istanbul. 650,000 Turkish lira worth of counterfeit disinfectants were seized in Adana. 3 individuals were arrested in Villarica, Italy, for making illicit hand sanitizer. In Saudi Arabia, a warehouse containing counterfeit hand sanitizer was raided in Riyadh. So the key point there with these aspects is that criminals are going to take advantage of this situation and try and use fake and counterfeit goods to actually make money out of it and actually cause further risks to the general public's health. Medical quarantines and lockdowns. So it's almost certain that medical quarantines are going to take place globally. And these quarantines are highly likely to be in place for months, so the near term, and measures to maintain control of the virus are highly likely to be in place for the short term. So that's 6 months to 2 years. Now, these medical quarantines will become less palatable to the general public the longer they are in place. They will also create resentment to the government if they show limited progress of getting the virus under control, which may have an impact on the political stability of the country. Also, that resentment will increase as the economy is impacted, people lose their jobs, and they receive fines and punishments for breaking quarantines. So some examples of this: so 1,500 people arrested for curfew violations across Sri Lanka. 2 fined in Konya in Turkey for violating the 14-day quarantine. And in France, police who were enforcing confinement measures were attacked with rocks. Now, no injuries were reported, but it seems highly likely that police enforcing these measures will face violence from the general public. Depending on how bad that gets, will decide if the military will be required to provide policing duties. Now, it's my assessment that it's highly likely the military will be used for policing duties as the crisis wears on. Multiple people were arrested in France for ignoring COVID-19 containment rules, and the police handed out 4,000 fines during day 1 of lockdown across France. So moving on then to the societal impact. So what impact will COVID-19 have on society? And the first point to discuss is social anxiety. So these are extraordinary times where people are being confined to their homes with limited freedom. This is leading to anxiety. And recently, a teenage girl died after taking her own life over fears that she was going to be stuck inside by COVID-19. And doctors are warning that this will have significant mental health, and the stresses and conditions will likely lead to an increase in domestic abuse and suicide. This is going to be made worse by people like this man who are out there licking the poles of a subway. There are some strange people which are just worsening the situation. And I've already mentioned the hate crimes against medical personnel over fears for getting COVID-19. However, hate crime is also another key issue going forward, and it's almost certain that hate crimes are going to increase. And whilst these will be particularly aimed at people of Asian appearance, what we are finding is that where the virus is currently flaring, people from that area are then the victims of hate crimes as people are afraid of getting COVID-19. So these are a selection of incidents from New York against people of Asian appearance. And in the US, there is actually a spike in gun ownership amongst Asian Americans due to these hate crimes, which is a worrying trend. In Jamaica, a man was assaulted after sneezing on a bus in Bethel town. So people thought he might have COVID-19 and therefore assaulted the man. The US Embassy in Cameroon reported a rise in anti-foreigner sentiment in Yaoundé. And in Bulgaria, 6 British nationals were forced off a flight out of Bulgaria due to the risk of them spreading COVID-19, even though there was no reports that they actually had COVID-19. In Turkey, another example, so an Afghan migrant was stabbed in Konya after being asked if he brought COVID-19 to Turkey. Moving on to police, so changes to policing. It's almost certain that the police will become overwhelmed by the crisis and will have to prioritise crime. And it's my assessment that it's highly likely that the military will be used for policing duties as the crisis wears on. So police will be forced to enact a graduated withdrawal of service from their normal duties if the coronavirus outbreak worsens, senior officers have said. And emergency laws are being enacted to give officers the power to detain people with symptoms or force them to undergo testing. But forces across the country are drawing up contingencies to lose a fifth of their staff to illness or self-isolation, putting pressure on their capacity as they are required to take on new duties. And police across England and Wales are to prioritise public order over crime in a recent statement from the Police Federation, whilst Police Scotland have requested that volunteer special constables increase their hours after unprecedented demand. Some examples, so Tower Hamlets Neighbourhood Police were providing security patrols to supermarkets. A supermarket in Bristol called for police to assist in enforcing shopping hours. Police have been used in Greece to protect pharmacies and supermarkets. A police officer was spat on in Germany by a person who actually claimed to have COVID-19. And we're seeing this as kind of a trend going forward. So large crowds in this report from a West Yorkshire police officer is that as the police were trying to actually control the large crowd and asking them to move back, they were being coughed at and spat at by the people who were actually trying to control. And another example of this in Montpellier, so 2 unaccompanied minors who attempted to rob a woman. When he actually went to the police station in detention, he claimed that he had COVID-19 and the police had to bring a doctor in to actually check and make sure that he didn't, which he did not have. Now, this incident highlighted a worrying possible tactic of criminals to actually exacerbate the police at a time of crisis and emergency by falsely claiming to have COVID-19. In Dudley, a suspect thief who was caught by shop staff claimed to have COVID-19. Again, another example of it being used as a tactic. And worrying in France, 5,000 police officers sick or self-isolating with COVID-19 symptoms. Now, France has the issue that the police are probably suffering fatigue after policing the Yellow Vest for 2 years during difficult policing duties. And these are actually quite a lot of videos of police brutality coming out of France at the moment, which is not the image that they want to be held by the public at this time of stress, which could actually exacerbate the situation and lead to demonstrations and riots. French police unions have threatened strikes if officers are not provided with hygiene and medical supplies. And just a couple of examples as to how the police could be stretched. So in Tehran, there was a panic buying of fuel after rumours that the fuel stations were going to be shut down because of COVID-19. And in Sweden, there was an interesting report saying that the police are warning of drug-related offences are going to increase during COVID-19 as restrictions are imposed. Now, police fear that the increasing restrictions will restrict the freedom of movement to drug dealers, and this will in turn raise the prices and prevent users from receiving their supplies. And associated crime will likely occur as drug users look for ways to ensure that they have enough money to afford drugs or attempt to steal medication. So criminals using COVID-19 as an opportunity, it's almost certain that criminal elements will use it as an opportunity. And some examples of this, so Suriname, the police force warned residents against criminals posing as being part of the COVID-19 response team. Similar situation of people dressed in white coats claiming to be municipality workers in Hungary in order to actually conduct criminality. Fraudsters were attempting to enter properties posing as coronavirus testers in southeast London. And there are unconfirmed reports of masked men actually targeting people for robbery near ATMs in London. And social media reporting suggested that they were using the advantage of quiet streets caused by COVID-19 to actually target individuals who are withdrawing money from cash points. Robbers allegedly distributed asphyxiating masks at the entrance to Dakar, and allegedly once the mask was worn, the person passed out and the victim was robbed in a more extreme example. And we're also seeing an increase in cyber incidents related to COVID-19. So in Norway, there was an increase in cyber scams associated with coronavirus targeting elderly. And this is one that I actually personally received. This was an offer for free toilet paper with a button at the bottom to click continue. The use of the military. So it's almost certain that the military is going to be used to varying degrees to combat the effects of COVID-19. Depending on the level of associated criminality and civil unrest will depend if the military are used just for a support or actual policing duties. Now, in the US, the National Guard are now active in multiple states. In New York, Mayor de Blasio asked President Trump to send the military. He asked for medically trained soldiers to address the escalating shortages. And in the UK, the army are being used to help organise food deliveries for up to 1.5 million people who are believed to be at highest risk of coronavirus. And some examples of where the military are already being used as part of COVID-19. So troops were deployed at the port of Barcelona. The army was deployed in New York. Army were used to enforce the lockdown in the Lombardy region of northern Italy. And also vigilante groups is something that we're actually starting to witness. Now, it's unlikely to plausible that vigilante groups may appear during this crisis, but during the London riots, self-protection squads were set up by shopkeepers to protect their businesses from being targeted. And this will depend on how the security situation develops, but we have seen the Guardian Angels group being used to patrol Chinatown due to the increase in hate crimes. And in more extreme scenarios, Muqtada al-Sadr offered to deploy his militia of fighters to Baghdad to actually help enforce the COVID-19 curfew. And in Rio de Janeiro, organized crime gangs are actually enforcing their own COVID-19 lockdown. And they were circulating threatening messages which said that the gangsters will teach people to respect the 8 p.m. shutdown. So the impact on the justice system, it's almost certain that the court systems will be significantly impacted by COVID-19, and it's highly likely that courts will have to close altogether. Now, in France, the courts are closed for all but essential litigation, and the European Court of Human Rights has cancelled all hearings in March and April, apart from those that were where a suspension would cause irreparable damage. The Italian and Irish courts have been closed under government decrees, and the European Court of Justice is suspended for the next 2 weeks at least. Poor technology means that video link hearings are impossible in the UK. And in the past 2 weeks in New York and other cities, the courts have not quite come to a halt, but they have slowed to a crawl. Trials have been delayed, grand juries have been put on hold, and sentencings have been postponed. Judges have been urged to avoid conducting hearings in person, and jury trials longer than 3 days have been suspended. Non-urgent cases will likely be postponed until the pandemic is under control. However, this could cause a 6 to 12-month backlog of cases, not to mention the likely increase in cases due to civil unrest and increased criminality during the pandemic period, as well as coronavirus litigation like businesses chasing money owed, insurance claims, employment tribunals, and so on. Governments in many countries impacted by COVID-19 will likely have to shut down their court systems altogether during the pandemic, worsening the problem. And the legal system in the UK is archaic and has seen little technological advancement. Therefore, we may see significant investment following COVID-19 in order to update systems and processes to conduct trial hearings in a more efficient manner. So just to highlight that instance, so Crown cases in England and Wales longer than 3 days have been postponed, and court trials have been cancelled amidst COVID-19 fears across France. So the impact on the prison system, it's almost certain that prisons will witness unrest over the COVID-19 emergency. We've already seen multiple riots at prisons linked to COVID-19, either through inmate fears of being infected or due to the relatives of prisoners not being able to visit. We've recorded riots in Italy, France, Germany, and Peru. However, it seems highly likely that most countries will witness unrest at their prisons in relation to the COVID-19 outbreak. And similarly, there's a risk that as COVID-19 begins to infect people at detention centres, there is a risk of unrest and rioting. The knock-on effect is that either police will have to be used to bring order back to prisons and detention centres that are witnessing unrest, further overstretching the police. In the case that the military are required to be used as part of this operation, with the high levels of Islamic extremists and radicalised population in Europe, the military could be seen as a high-value target for prisoners in order to conduct attacks. So some examples, so 2 prison officers were injured in a riot, that was on the 23rd. Disturbance at a prison in France where 100 inmates were assembling together and refusing to obey instructions. Prison inmates were rioting at a prison in India, and in an alternative method of protest, some prisoners were actually going on hunger strike in Jodhpur. Her Majesty Prison Northumberland was at risk, or reportedly at risk, of COVID-19 due to the dwindling hygiene supplies, so another aspect to this. And just showing you within the platform, you can actually filter for the tag of COVID-19 and then riot and actually visualize where these protests are actually taking place. So the impact on migration into Europe, it's almost certain that the COVID-19 crisis will exacerbate the plight of migrants. Now, at the Greek border, you have hundreds of migrants trying to get into Europe. Now, it should be noted that Turkey has actually supplied migrants. There's actual video footage of migrants firing gas and firing guns across the border. And even Turkish police have fired hundreds of rounds of gas canisters over the Greek border at the weekend as they attempted to force the migrants across into Europe. Now, the global closing of borders is making the situation worse, and the application for asylum is also restricted. It can only take place if the applicant has submitted a negative test for COVID-19 or after a 14-day quarantine period. Germany has also frozen its humanitarian reception programs for refugees from Turkey and Lebanon after pledging to receive 5,500 people, mostly Syrians, this year. The pandemic is hampering the asylum system throughout Europe after the European Union closed its external borders for a period of 30 days. And if the COVID-19 cases increase in Greece, crime rises and security priorities are placed on keeping cities safe rather than the Greek-Turkish border, and then Turkey lets all the migrants rush in with no barrier to stop them, we could have hundreds of thousands of migrants actually rushing through Europe who could potentially become carriers of COVID-19. Approximately 1 million undocumented migrants living under the radar in the UK could be at risk not only of contracting COVID-19, but also of starvation because of the crisis created by the pandemic, charities have warned. Now, nobody knows exactly how many of these migrants are currently in the UK, as the Home Office does not have comprehensive records of their whereabouts. This group of asylum seekers whose claims the Home Office has rejected were also fearful of returning to their home countries, and this could also include temporary workers whose visas have expired. Now, a report published in November 2019 by the Pew Research Centre stated that there could be between 800,000 and 1.2 million of these migrants currently in the UK. Now, it's highly likely that these undocumented migrants are going to be severely impacted by COVID-19, which is also going to have an effect on the health system and criminality. Impact on schools and children. It's almost certain that the schools closing will have a negative effect on criminality through children being bored and trying to find something to occupy their time. Now, some incidents: an elderly couple were actually coughed at by youths in Hitchin. In Australia, kids deliberately coughed on a shop attendant in Cranbourne Park in Melbourne. And we've seen multiple instances of these where children are actually starting to engage in criminality, probably linked to the boredom of not being at school and the restriction in their ability to actually do things. Moving on to the impact on food supply, it's almost certain that the food supply will be impacted by the crisis. Initially, this will take the form of panic buying. However, when logistical chains are impacted, the variety and quantity of goods will be impacted, likely leading to rationing. Now, COVID-19 has led to panic buying and stockpiling of food, and shelves are now empty of essentials such as milk and bread, which in the West is not down to a lack of food, but it is a logistical issue due to the sudden demand. The supply chains are now trying to catch up. In the UK, the military is being drafted in to help feed the 1.5 million people identified as being particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 who will be told to stay at home for 12 weeks. And across Europe, the message has been there is an abundance of food, and by stockpiling, you are creating unnecessary strain on the system. Where food supply is likely going to be impacted is either due to the security and criminality, economic difficulties, labour shortages, and closed borders, which will all leave nations having to rely on their internal food production capabilities for a period. In the UK, the Country Land and Business Association, which represents more than 30,000 landowners and rural farms, estimates that the shortage of workers could hit 80,000 at a crucial time and leave crops rotting in the field. In China, farmers are suffering a shortage of labour, seed and fertiliser in the wake of a nationwide lockdown to control the spread of COVID-19, and this has raised fears over food shortages in China, which may have near-term consequences. Some examples. So the old Vicarage Hotel was burgled in Shropshire, where over £1,000 worth of food was actually stolen, and that was due to be delivered as part of a community food delivery service. 2 supermarket delivery vans were torched in Southmead, and we can see that escalating to delivery drivers, these sort of obvious targets of people delivering food actually being targeted. Burglars targeted a French charity warehouse in Caen who were trying to steal food, and they were arrested. And these are just some examples. So within the platform, you can actually filter for COVID-19 and then filter for affray. And this is showing incidents of violence at supermarkets, so people actually fighting over and whilst they're actually conducting panic buying. In a more extreme incident, so during panic buying in Georgia, 2 men actually slashed each other with broken wine bottles. And within the platform, again, you can actually filter for food shortages. So this is just highlighting in the developing world, in places such as Honduras, army personnel have had to bring bags of food to residents as containment measures are causing a lack of money for food. Now, if this exacerbates, we could witness food demonstrations, as well as riots, as well as increasing levels of criminality as people actually try to feed themselves. And again, in more authoritarian countries, so a man was actually arrested for filming empty shelves of food in Saudi Arabia. Price gouging is a key issue, and it's almost certain that it's going to occur during this period. Now, shopkeepers who conduct price gouging will create negative sentiment amongst the general public and will likely paint themselves as a target during periods of civil unrest. And some examples of this: in Brazil, a shop was found to be selling masks at abusive prices. In Italy, medical supplies were confiscated from a pharmacy for price gouging in Rome. Impact on travel. It's almost certain that travel is going to be impacted in the near term and highly likely to be impacted in the next 6 months to 2 years. And as the pandemic circulates around the globe, nations will close their borders in order to reduce the rate of infection. And if relapses occur, such as when restrictions are being lifted, it's only going to actually worsen the problem. And some examples of this: so New Zealand, they've imposed a mandatory self-isolation period. Large crowds were seen outside the Iraqi Airways office in Cairo because there was an announcement that all flights between Iraq and Egypt had been suspended. And moving on to religion and COVID-19. Now, it's highly likely religious communities are going to be impacted more heavily by COVID-19. Now, this was a really interesting article on the right-hand side in The Independent, which stated that the NHS believed that Muslims are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. And the author writes that if Muslims feel let down, excluded or forgotten by the government response, there will be repercussions that will last longer than the outbreak. He states in the article that many Muslims live in extended families, often like the author's household, with 3 generations under one roof. And this means that there are a higher number of carriers who can infect an elderly relative. Another person who cannot effectively self-isolate when they're living in close quarters with children and grandchildren. And he goes on to talk about social customs, including how meals are eaten and how social distancing is both alien and absurd to them. And he goes on to state that in pockets of Muslim communities, there is mistrust or simple unawareness of government advice. And he goes on to state that this trauma is going to spread through Muslim communities as the crisis develops. And a ban on gatherings of more than 100 people is essentially a ban on Muslim funerals, stating that he's never been to one with fewer than 300 attendees. So this is a point that we have to bear in mind, that different cultures will be impacted potentially more significantly by COVID-19, and this could actually lead to anger. And some examples: so in Nigeria, worshippers continue to attend churches and mosques despite the ban. A Kenyan pastor, he was actually suspended for calling COVID-19 a hoax. Police dispersed mosque goers in Dakar. And residents barricaded a road in Dakar to protest the arrest of an imam who he was arrested because he defied the ban on public gatherings. In Nigeria, an Islamic scholar warned the president against shutting down mosques in the state. And community tensions as well. It's almost certain that community tensions are going to increase during this period. Now, whether that's just due to examples like rural communities warning non-locals not to visit tourist areas for fear of them bringing COVID-19, or just communities who have historically had tensions, seeing an increase in those tensions during a period of national crisis. And there will always be those, of course, who try and seek to benefit from this crisis. So as an example, this nationalist leader, he was assaulted outside an Islamic center in Copenhagen. As he stated, he was there to monitor whether or not the Islamic center was actually complying with the ban on public assemblies. Extremist groups, it's highly likely that extremist groups will seek to benefit their causes through this period of crisis. So whether it's leftist groups calling for flash mobs, riots and looting, like this group called Revolutionary Antibodies in Germany. Federal law enforcement documents reveal that white supremacists have discussed using coronavirus as a bioweapon. They had talked about weaponizing it via saliva or spray bottles. Also, there's reports saying that because of social distancing and an increase in anti-Asian sentiment or anti-foreign sentiment in general, this could actually lead to a spike in white nationalism off the back of this. And there are other groups out there. So, for example, you have a tweet here from Extinction Rebellion East Midlands, who state that, so the actual poster states, "Corona is the cure, humans are the disease." And they state, "The undeniable truth is the earth is recovering thanks to Corona." Now, at the bottom there, Extinction Rebellion from Kensington and Chelsea actually state this post is a disgrace and breaks Extinction Rebellion values and principles. But, it highlights that you will always get extremists within any group. Terrorism. It's plausible that terrorist groups will conduct terrorist attacks during this period, and they will be impacted, though, by the lack of large social gatherings and therefore targets, as well as the logistical supply of items for sophisticated attacks such as explosives or weapons. However, we have already seen an attack recently. So on the 20th of March, 2 Albanian nationals were arrested after crashing their car into the interior of Barcelona's airport. The 2 perpetrators shouted Islamist slogans as they carried out the act. So we can't rule that out completely, but because of this lack of social gatherings, there is a restriction on actual appropriate or opportunist targets for them to actually go after. So onto the economy. It's almost certain that there's going to be a significant global economic impact as a result of this pandemic. Now, in the US, the worst month for job losses during the financial crisis was 800,000 in March 2009. And some forecasts see April quintupling that or worse, and forecasts for that month range from 500,000 to 5 million. Now, Steve Blitz, the chief US economist at TS Lombard, has projected when all is said and done, the unemployment rate will be 10.6%, and there will be 17.9 million Americans on the unemployment line, or about 12 million more than in February. The current jobless rate is 3.5%, the lowest in more than 50 years in the US. Now, governments and financial institutions are cutting interest rates to help stimulate the economy, as well as printing money. However, you can't shut down the global economy for long periods and this not have significant repercussions. As I mentioned in our downloadable ebook, COVID-19 Intelligence Support, Analysis Forecast and Scenario Planning, which you can access on our LinkedIn company page, the global stock market is seeing corrections in the region of 25%, and this is now a bear market, and there is widespread pessimism and negative investor sentiment. Until the scale of the outbreak is known, which nobody knows, nobody will know how big the financial impact or the unemployment levels are going to be. And the economic and social costs of the widespread unemployment include the following. So one is an increase in homelessness, stress and health problems, increase in mental anxiety, depression, and a rise in health problems compounded by the shortage of pharmaceutical drugs and long-term sufferers. And studies have found that the outcomes of unemployment include depression, substance abuse, increase in psychiatric hospital admissions, death by suicide, and violence. And areas of high unemployment, especially youth unemployment, tend to have more crime and vandalism. And it can lead to an alienation and difficulties in integrating young employed people into society. And the period of mass unemployment in the 1930s actually led to social unrest and a rise in extremist ideologies. And persistent joblessness for men is then linked to breakdowns in traditional family arrangements, including the use of public assistance and high crime. So the point that I'm making here is, a significant impact on unemployment globally is going to have a significant impact on the security situation globally as well. And a good analogy is the seesaw effect of trying to balance the economy with actually defeating the virus. If you completely go all out in an attempt to defeat the virus, you're going to actually destroy the economy. So governments are trying to conduct a balancing act at the moment. And just some examples. So Air Canada laying off 5,000 workers, Audi and Volkswagen in Mexico stopping production, Newmont Mining reducing operations in Peru. And also strikes and protests are going to have an impact on productivity and therefore the economy more widely as well. Another example, Amazon workers in France protesting over COVID-19 concerns. Economic stress indicators, so again, something that we actually track. So things like this, so Bank of America branch suffering a run on depositor $100 bill withdrawals. As well as in Austria, we saw depositors increasing cash withdrawals to 2 or 3 times the normal levels at ATMs across Austria as people are actually starting to hoard cash. Now, the worry is that if we see some sort of period of economic downturn, do we then actually see an increase in bank runs, which is going to have an impact on the security situation as well and the stability of a country. The logistical impact, it's almost certain that logistical chains will be impacted by this pandemic in the near term, but also the short term. And as global manufacturing hubs shut down, borders close, companies go out of business and the economic impact is felt, as well as the risks of protectionism and anti-globalization, logistical chains will eventually shake out in the near term into some sort of new equilibrium. And some examples of how it's being impacted. The Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs requested Hungary to open 3 more border crossing points, and there are 30-kilometre long traffic queues formed on the border of Hungary. So we're already starting to see impacts on logistics. And in Norway, another example, they're actually enhancing border measures as part of the COVID-19. Conspiracy theories and fake news. If there's one thing that actually spreads quicker than COVID-19, it is the conspiracy theories that are linked to it. And we've seen everything from the Kremlin blaming the UK for the COVID-19 outbreak. And some slurs that they actually included were the British smeared something in Wuhan in the same way that they smeared nerve agent on the Scribbles door handle. The LDPR leader, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, he said that America could be causing the coronavirus outbreaks in China. We've also seen Jews and Zionists being accused, people stating that they want to design the world, seize countries, and neuter the world's population. Iran's leader, he refuses US help, and he's been citing that the COVID-19 virus is specifically built for Iran using the genetic data of Iranians. And even in the US, the Washington Times, they published an article which is now no longer available, stating that the coronavirus could be linked to a Chinese biowarfare program in the Wuhan area. Also, more broadly, there's been arrests for people posting fake news in places like Egypt, Kyrgyzstan, Morocco, a man arrested for spreading fake news in Saudi Arabia, and police were seeking a woman who spread fake news about martial law in the Czech Republic. So moving on to the political aspects, so what impact will COVID-19 have on the global political environment? So one is the public's perception on how the crisis is being handled. Now, it's almost certain that the sitting governments will be accused of not handling the COVID-19 crisis appropriately, leading to political uncertainty. And COVID-19 is likely to delay new elections, which will likely cause resentment amongst the population if they perceive the government as to be squatting whilst not actually getting a grip of the crisis. And this could lead to demonstrations and civil unrest. Governments are also banning gatherings and demonstrations linked to other issues, which could cause them political issues as well. And just one example, we have loads on the platform. So there were protests against President Bolsonaro's response to the COVID-19 pandemic held across Sao Paulo. And the worry is as the crisis gets worse, then what we actually see is an increase in demonstrations and protests and a lot of global political uncertainty going forward. So the impact on international relations, it's highly likely that international relations will be adjusted because of this crisis. So the COVID-19 crisis, it's an opportunity for nations to actually improve relations and forge new partnerships. Russia have sent a consignment of protective masks and coats, ventilators, swabs and testing equipment, which was received in a high-profile reception from the Foreign Minister, Luigi Di Maio, there to see the equipment arrive. And the equipment reportedly was covered in stickers which stated, "From Russia with love." This occurred at a time when the European Union stirred up resentment by restricting exports of critical medical supplies as they prepare their own healthcare systems for all the significant increase in COVID-19 cases. This opportunistic diplomacy comes at a time when the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in the UK still hangs heavily over Russia's reputation in Europe. And China are also on the facing criticism in the West over COVID-19. Their alleged cover-up and concealment of the death counts, and they're also on a PR offensive, sending medical equipment to France, Serbia, Liberia, Czech Republic, and the Philippines. And the choices of some of those countries are interesting because, like the Philippines, most have either fallen out or are falling out of the US's sphere of influence. In February, the Philippines notified the US that it intended to withdraw from the Visiting Forces Agreement, which since 1999 has allowed the presence of American troops. US officials were surprised and dismayed by this action, and China's move looks to be aimed at freezing out a key US ally in the dispute over the South China Sea. There's the incident there of the Russian military actually sending medical equipment to Italy. And this is an interesting video which claimed that this was an Italian mayor who was videoed taking down the European Union flag and replacing it with the Russian flag. Chinese medical supplies arriving in France. So moving on to what's going to happen next, the most likely courses of action. So based on our research, the following appear to be the generally held scenarios regarding COVID-19 and its growth. So the first scenario is that the response works and the behaviour adapts sufficiently to slow the spread of COVID-19. Some widespread measures are still required to contain the spread, but behavioural changes slow the infection rate and keep the health system working. Scenario 2, which is the medium case, is that there is a rolling wave of COVID-19 infection spikes that stress the local and regional health systems. Governments take a more aggressive steps to enforce social distancing, and a sharp economic growth slowdown ensues, extending through the second quarter. And we feel that we're already at this scenario. The worst case scenario is that China suffers a relapse as it ramps up its economic activity. The world struggles to contain the spread of the virus, leading to longer pandemic and global recession, leading to multiple quarters of negative earnings growth, and infection levels are comparable to H1N1 and swine flu, roughly 1 billion. However, COVID-19 has a higher mortality rate compared to H1N1, which was sub 0.1%. Now, with a 1% mortality rate, that would be 10 million people who actually die as a result of COVID-19. Now, based on current evidence, we believe that scenario 2 with elements of scenario 3 are now the most likely. The most dangerous courses of action are additional sort of elements to what we've previously stated. So one is that as China tries to revive its economy without risking more lives, they actually end up causing a relapse of COVID-19, which leads to scenario 3. But also a mutation is something that we're also monitoring. Now, scientists in Iceland claim that they found 40 mutations of the coronavirus. And the Icelandic scientists were able to trace the coronavirus back to 3 European countries: Austria, Italy, the epicenter of the outbreak, and England. Now, 7 infected people all went to the same undisclosed football match in England, the team claim. And viruses accumulate mutations as they evolve, which may or may not cause them to behave in different ways. Now, mutating is a biological process by which would have allowed the virus to actually attack the human body in the first place. And scientists believe that the infection lurked in animals for years, perhaps even decades, before it gained the ability to actually jump to humans. Coronavirus is known as a virus that can mutate reasonably violently. And a previous study in China published in early March suggested that coronavirus had mutated into at least 2 separate strains since the outbreak began in December, with one having symptoms that were less obvious yet being more aggressive. Now, there is the threat that as it evolves again into a more aggressive version, causing increased infections and deaths. A global recession. So Jamie Bullard, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, told Bloomberg, this is a planned, organized partial shutdown of the US economy in the second quarter. The overall goal is to keep everyone's households and businesses whole. It's a huge shock that we're trying to cope with and keep it under control. And he sees the US employment rate hitting 30% in the coming months as the world continues to grapple with the coronavirus pandemic, which could be worse than it was during the Great Depression and 3 times worse than the 2007-2009 recession. The coronavirus will lead to an impending worldwide recession that could be worse than the one triggered by the financial crisis in 2008-2009. But the world output should recover in 2021 is what the International Monetary Fund has said this week. Now, as I mentioned earlier, no experts really know because they can't predict the pandemic's actions. However, what seems almost certain is that there is going to be a significant contraction of the global economy off the back of this. The impact on the developing world is absolutely key as well. In the West, we can turn around and say, right, we can self-isolate for a period of weeks, only going out to go to supermarkets. Now, in the developing world, where people are actually struggling to actually feed themselves, can those self-isolation measures actually be enforced? And with the quality of the medical care in the developing world, the worry is that the mortality rates are going to be far more higher than what we're actually seeing in the West. And one example of this is in Madagascar, where low-income households are actually defying the COVID-19 lockdown because the fear of hunger is actually driving many low-income households to defy it. And a second front is also something that we're actually monitoring. So what if a hostile actor used the chaos to open a second front against an enemy nation, perhaps using cyber means whilst the country is at its weakest, prompting large-scale civil unrest and perhaps regime change? And we've seen incidents of cyber attacks against the World Health Organization or the US Health Agency. One thing that we're monitoring is, could there actually be some sort of cyber attack between nations during this period of weakness to actually change the dynamic in that nation? And protectionism and an increase in extremism. So Europe was already sliding to the right off the back of years of economic stagnation. Now, can this situation advance that cause, and what impacts is that going to have on the world, is something that we think is going to make this a more dangerous course of action. So that concludes my presentation. A little bit about us at Intelligence Fusion. So we provide security professionals worldwide with highly tailored incident reporting and customizable web-based software. And we're the only software that is designed by and developed by intelligence analysts. Our clients, we're guided by their needs, and we use military intelligence doctrine to actually put tried and tested open source collection methods into action. And it's fused with an ever evolving data mining algorithm and a growing crowdsourced network. We deliver balanced, timely and relevant intelligence from a wider variety of verified sources than any other provider. And how we work, so we gather our intelligence through our internal team, through crowdsourcing and through data mining and machine learning. We then put all of that through an incident processing phase using intelligence doctrine, where we look at creation, evaluation, analysis and integration, and finally interpretation. And then we disseminate that intelligence through either our platform, through an API, or through our bespoke system. And these are the services that we provide. So we actually sell our data feed to many other security and intelligence companies. We build bespoke intelligence platforms for clients. We're currently building a bespoke intelligence platform for one of the world's largest oil and gas companies, and we've been retained for the next 8 years to do maintenance and upgrades to that platform. And we also sell subscriptions to our platform, as well as doing outsourced intelligence support. And at the moment, we've created a new option. So one is the monthly intelligence subscription. So we're now offering temporary emergency access to Intelligence Fusion to help make the best possible decisions regarding your people and operations as the outbreak evolves. The cost is £1,000 per month. There's no long-term contract. You can cancel whenever. There's an online setup, 24/7 monitoring, and you can pay on a month-by-month basis. And what do you get access to? You get access to our COVID-19 feed, all of our additional incident data, which currently sits at 12,000 incidents per month, as well as our historical intelligence data of 360,000 global incidents. And why should you use Intelligence Fusion? We help you make better decisions through crisis. We save you time, money, and resource, and we have a multi-award-winning intelligence platform. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time today and listening to my presentation. The last thing I want to do is just get to the webinar questions. So we had some questions that came through. So the first question was, what are the short and long-term impacts on the logistics sector, especially on import and export business? Short-term, national governments imposing restrictions on specific exports, such as pharmaceutical drugs, medical masks, severe supply chain disruption in manufacturing, retail and agriculture. And the long-term, COVID-19 can possibly lead companies to diversify their supply chains or to reshore their production to prevent similar disruption in the future. And we're already seeing production of medical supplies being reshored. Additionally, the COVID-19 crisis presents isolationist politicians with another argument to pursue nationalist policies that decouple their economies from those of other countries. The second question, border and border control might take national stage, and will it contribute to a rise in political extremism? So a rise in political extremism may result indirectly due to a worsened economic situation. More direct impact maybe from criminal networks, for example, human trafficking into out of quarantine zones, or trafficking of goods such as drugs. Such activities may potentially be carried out by pre-existing extremist groups. And perhaps we see a shift in focus for organised and opportunistic crime towards medical and food supplies. In terms of borders, the potential is definitely out there for political extremism as a flashpoint, but it may ebb and flow, for example, as the EU countries quickly established internal borders and then took them mostly down again to refocus their efforts on a herd mentality external border scheme. And increased hate crime reporting towards Asians could highlight an extremist problem. And the last question, because we're running out of time, the impact on the current pandemic crisis in Latin America, the economic and external debt. So I've actually got an answer here from our South America analyst. So the economy of Latin America countries will take a significant hit, with some hit worse than others. And this is due to the decline in demand and price of commodities as countries and companies shut down their production lines, as well as go into quarantine, as well as disruptions in supply chains and tourism. Economies that are heavily reliant on trade with China and the United States will be significantly impacted depending on the slowdown in growth in those countries. The price of copper is going down and is impacting Chile's economy significantly, as it is the top producer of copper. Mining has accounted for approximately 10% of Chile's GDP for several decades, and a slowdown in the demand for minerals will impact it hard. The COVID-19 virus also compounds the economic effects already felt by months of political unrest. In Ecuador, they've said that they would look for emergency funding to get through the COVID-19 crisis, and we're looking to possibly restructuring some of its debt repayments. The economy of Ecuador is heavily dependent on petroleum resources, and the price of oil being so low has significant impacts. China is buying large quantities of soybeans from Brazil at the moment due to the weak real, but the crisis may put even more strain on the supply chains, as ports in Brazil are already backed up due to the high demand, delays in harvest and high rainfall in February. There have been talks of strikes by port workers demanding better safety measures against COVID-19, but nothing has materialized yet. And any port strike will be detrimental to the Brazilian economy. The price of the oil going down will also impact Brazil's economy. Moving on to Argentina, which is already in a recession for the past 2 years, and the pandemic does not bode well for the country. President Fernandez has been working to restructure a significant portion of the country's debt by the end of March, but that seems unlikely at the moment. President Fernandez's economic recovery plan involved boosting exploitation at the Vaca Muerta shale reserves, but the impact on the global economy makes investment uncertain, and current oil prices would not make it sustainable. And the country is currently on lockdown from the 20th of March to the 1st of April, slowing down the economy. And if it is extended, it could impact the soybean harvest in April, further impacting a critical sector of Argentina's economy. And finally, Credit Suisse forecasts a 4% shrink in Mexico's GDP. The border restrictions put in place between the US and Mexico, with exceptions for commercial traffic, will have significant impacts on border cities which rely on cross-border travel and spending. The price of oil going down will impact its economic significantly. And that's all the time I've got for questions. Thank you very much for attending.